Hey guys, it's Graham. What's cracking? Let's talk about James Bond. I read the first James Bond novel in 2013, Casino Royale, novelization of the movie that has, if I understand right, been adapted twice, although most people haven't heard of or seen the first one. If memory serves, it's actually a black and white film, might be just that old. But the Daniel Craig 2006 version was just incredible. It's one of the top Bond movies that have been made. I grew up in a household of Bond fans. My dad loved the movies. They all came out when he was a little kid. The books have been in print for over 70 years. In fact, the second one that I just read today was Live and Let Die, which was published in 1954. So I don't know how many in total Ian Fleming wrote. I just know that a lot of them have been adapted to films, and there's even some debate amongst the fans and the viewers as to which ones they officially recognize or which ones had the actual kind of studio blessing versus which ones were made without the proper rights or so. I don't know. I haven't tracked all of that. I just know that generally, at some point or another, I have seen all of the Bond movies, but I can't sort them all in my head, and I couldn't tell you what the plots are of all of them individually. In a sense, it's like Reacher. There are story beats to it. Cool, intense opening scene, and then a montage with a popular song, and then Bond checks in with MI6, and they give him a mission, and he goes out, and he meets a woman, and then he has an encounter with the bad guy, and then he goes and licks his wounds, and then the woman gets taken. Probably around this time, he's already slept with her, and then a big showdown with the bad guy, and he wins, and then he sleeps with the woman again, and then you never see her again, like ever in the whole series. So, like that's a general Bond story. Um, the books, though, since they came out so long ago, they've become kind of period pieces, and so the movies since then have been various attempts to kind of stay true to the spirit of who Bond was, but tell the story of their decade. For example, the Casino Royale book has him going up against Russian baddies, but the Casino Royale movie from 2006, I'm pretty sure like Le Chiffre was French, but the bad guys he was working with were Algerian terrorists that wanted to crash a plane because this was only 5 years after 9/11. So they kind of wanted to tap into what people were currently thinking about as like general enemies of the West and who are we up against. But yeah, in the book it was Russians because this book came out right in the early years of the Cold War. Another thing I noticed about Casino Royale was, unlike other other movies in the film franchise, this one was generally a reboot. They did carry over Judi Dench as M, but obviously she's not the same M that was in all of the Brosnan movies because this is kind of a new continuity. Bond has just become a double O agent. There's no real like Q yet. Q comes in during Quantum of Solace, and he's just kind of a guy in the chair. There isn't so much like, hey, let's make a cool thing where the watch has a laser in it or whatever. There's a little bit of that in the books so far, but you get the idea. They try to make them thrilling for the time that the movies are made in, and the books are also a product of their time. The reason I go to such lengths to emphasize that is just, hey, language changes over the years, and there are terms used for different things and people in this 1954 book that have since become taboo and people wouldn't say. However, it was announced by a publisher recently that they were going to tidy up and remove certain pieces of language from the books to make them more acceptable to the modern audiences or whatever. I am 10,000% against that. I don't think that you should be editing somebody else's work like that so that it's palatable to you. I understand that, for example, in cinema, there are services like VidAngel that exist that you can set filters to it so that if you wanted to watch a movie but you didn't want to have a whole bunch of F-bombs or sex scenes in it, you can turn that on and it'll just skip those parts. You're still buying a copy of it as the creator intended, and you're just not hitting the content pieces that you really don't care for. In books, I don't know, maybe you could pay for a fully caffeinated Kindle version, but they introduce an ebook filter that changes certain words to other words, and you just know, like, okay, well, I don't want to see this word or hear that word, so maybe it can just be this, that, or the other thing. But the idea of like printing it and making it fixed so that it's the only version you can buy and telling people that this is the way that they have to buy it, I've got an issue with that. You don't get to change the creator's words, especially after the creator's long gone. If there's still value in his work enough for you as the publisher or the rights holder to make money off of it, like, don't go telling him that he was wrong to tell it the way that he did. It was a product of its time. It is a period piece. Where am I going with all this? Well, Live and Let Die is a villain. It's a Bond story with a villain who is like leaning very heavily into like Haitian voodoo and stuff, Baron Samedi and all that. As the book was playing out, I remember like scenes from different kind of voodoo themed action pieces in this Bond movie that I was like, oh yeah, I remember there was a Baron Samedi, and I remember that there was this voodoo guy and that voodoo thing or whatever. Well, in the book, they use words that were cool to use in the 50s, but not cool to use now. Everything was Negro or Negress, which was just a descriptor term for a black person. And then African American became the term du jour until a few years ago when capital B Black became the way that you had to say it. This all has a very interesting synchronicity with a post that my friend Brad Torgerson put up on Twitter earlier this week that I just saw again today because it got RT'd by Az from Heels versus Babyface, so way to go, Brad. But there's this presentism in pop culture where every time basically like a non-white, non-straight, non-male character is put into any kind of role or any kind of existing IP, you're bludgeoned into basically thinking like, oh, this is the first time that this has happened. And it's not. Like, this has been around since freaking forever. And Brad shared stills from the 1960s and 70s or whatever Star Trek, where there were all kinds of minority characters. And in this case, he shared 4 pictures of different black characters. There was obviously the main character, like the main 7 character, Uhura, played by Nichelle Nichols. But others came along as well. It was always a show that was very ahead of its time in terms of like depicting a world where there's going to be people that look different that are all united in a common cause: exploration, diplomacy, etc. These things have been around forever. Anytime you hear about, hey, Jennifer Lawrence being the first female action star ever, all of the actual sci-fi fans will say, dude, we've had Ripley, we've had Sarah Connor, it's a long list. We had Linda Carter playing Wonder Woman in the 70s. Like, this is not new, but people want the social capital of bringing a novelty to right a civil moral wrong, and it's unnecessary, and to a larger point, it's just an excuse to cover up one's own lack of talent. Well, I wrote this mediocre story, but my main character is this kind of minority or special. So if anybody doesn't like it, I'll just call them a nist and a phobe. Like, how many years has this been going on now? We see it freaking all the time. And now this iteration of it in printing is that we've grabbed this classical piece of spy literature at this point. I don't know, 70 years old. How old does it have to be before it's considered a classic? Or say, okay, but it was wrong to be presented in the parlance of its time, and we need to shield you from the harm and the danger that it can do to the extent that you're not allowed to see the writer's own words. I don't know. It's something that stuck out to me as I was listening to this audiobook. It's like, oh, okay, this was written in the 50s. And there were words you could say then that are socially taboo now, and one of them was just this word, Negro or Negress, to describe a black man or a black woman. 'Twas the way that it was. Funnily enough, going back to the Star Trek thing, there was an episode where they had Abraham Lincoln on the deck of the Enterprise, and he saw Uhura, and he used that word. He's like, hey, you have one of these on your ship. And Kirk's like, we don't really use that word now. Like, we don't look at those kind of distinctions with people. She's our communications officer. And, oh, okay, it's just highlighting the difference in the time. Anyway, getting out into the weeds, that's just one minor thing to mention in the overall description of this story. The plot centers on Bond having to trace down the origins of gold coins that have been seeping into circulation that are supposed to be pirate coins from the last 400 or 500 years from the Caribbean, but their origin is dubious, and even the way that they're being pitched to MI6 is getting wind of it and saying it's kind of impossible for these to be these coins from this place. We need to find out what they really are. And Bond ends up having to fly down to Florida, and he goes to the core of a criminal ring, a criminal element led by a big, tough black dude. And this was relevant at the time period, and they mentioned this kind of at two different points in the book, saying, times are changing, times are advancing. We have prominent Negro athletes and scientists and writers and artists and all of that. It only makes sense then that eventually we'd have one pop up like this, where who's at the core of a very elaborate and powerful criminal enterprise, and that was what this villain was. They just called him the big man, and he had a whole bunch of different kind of voodoo themed henchmen under his wing, and he was a formidable villain. I remember this about both of these books now, about Casino Royale and about Live and Let Die. The Bond in the books, you can read the Bond in the books and then think about the different actors who have portrayed Bond in the movies and think, okay, I could see this being the same guy. But in print, you get a little bit more of Bond's inner monologue, and there are times when he's not scared or terrified. He's coming up against something, and in the movies, it's always it's Pierce Brosnan or Sean Connery or Daniel Craig or whatever, just being like kind of cool about it, but they got this look on their face like any one of us would be in this situation where, oh, yep, pain is inbound, but he just looks like, here it goes. I'm going to take this thing head on. In the books, he's like, this is going to suck, and he kind of braces himself for it, like he's getting tortured. In the first book, there is that whole scene where he gets whacked in the huevos by a skilled torturer, and in this book, one of the big man's henchmen breaks Bond's finger on his little hand. Like, he knows that he's coming to do it. Well, Bond is tied to a chair and he can't fight it, and it's painfully descriptive. And Bond is like, crap. He's not completely stoic in the face of pain or whatever. If he gets hurt, he acknowledges it. There's also a slight learning curve here and there where he's got to go prepare for this kind of scuba diving mission, and he takes a couple of weeks down in the Caribbean, learning about the different types of sea life and the different scuba gear and stuff that MI6 has made for him. That's where like the whole cool gadget piece of it comes into play, but it's not as gonzo as it is in the movies. It's just like, hey, I need a device that can do this, or that can dispense this kind of shark repellent, or that can do this, that, or the other thing, and it's all based on real technology. And he wires that off to MI6, and the Q department puts that together for him, and he uses it on his mission to go swim under some rock formation and enter the big man's base, or put a bomb on his boat. It's the kind of stuff that you see in the movies. It's just interesting to see how it was written in the books and how Fleming told all of that. And I found it to be a really cool read. I gave it 4 stars, Live and Let Die. It made me want to go back and watch some of the movies, which, now that I think about it, I haven't watched any of those older Bond movies in a very long time. I watched some of the Brosnan ones were on Prime a long time ago. I remember watching Tomorrow Never Dies and just thought, why don't we get more of these? They're short. They're like an hour and 35, hour and 40 minutes. You can tell that they're not breaking the bank on budget. They got to do a little bit of traveling, do some globe trotting and stuff, and they're not very heavy on the CGI. Die Another Day was heavy on that one, but budget was good, casting was good, pacing was all good. There were cool new stunts and set pieces and all that. I just think that's really what they need to get to. I understand that with this last one that Daniel Craig was in, there was Like it kind of got screwed by the COOF because it was supposed to come out in 2020 and then they had to delay it, but they had borrowed money, like the studio had borrowed money to finance it, and then that ended up compounding, and it got to the point where they would have needed to make like $1 billion just to break even on it, and that worked against them, among other things. I haven't seen it yet. I've heard things about it, but that's irrelevant because I haven't seen it. In fact, I haven't seen the last two Craig movies. I'm just kind of I'm not as high on the movies, I guess, as everybody else is, but I was interested enough to read the books, and especially to read them. Um, Once I heard that the publisher was going to be like, "Oh, we got to shield you from this," like the hell you do. Like, let me read this and see what the actual author had to say. And would that every other reader had the same mentality towards it. But that was Live and Let Die. Cool story. He got the setting right, and he does such a great job, Fleming, with description and the five senses, but without bogging you down in extra prose and verbiage and all of that. Language-wise, nothing really stood out to me. Obviously, Bond was excited to get it on with Solitaire, the femme fatale. Geez, now I'm trying to remember. Is this the one that Jane Seymour played? Because so many different actresses have played Bond girls over the years, and I know that she was one of them, but I can't remember. Anyway, do go check it out if you are so inclined. That'll do it for now. Thank you for listening. Till next time, drive safe, and I will see you out there.